a very warm welcome back to The Doctor Will See You Now. How is everything with you? Are you well? Are you reading well? Are you locked in the pages of some great mystery crime thriller? Well, if you are looking for a new read, if you are looking maybe for an author who you've never read before, we have, I think, today something quite exciting. You know how it is, I don't know, when suddenly books appear in your world and you think, this is a real treat. This is just what was needed. So viewers, listeners, stick with us for this conversation, and I can guarantee by the end, not one, but 2 books for your delight and pleasure. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Lynne McEwan and Heather Critchlow in for consultation. We were talking a little bit before we came on, saying you don't normally go to the doctors with a friend or a stranger to talk about your ailments. Well, in the book world, of course, it's always a great pleasure to get together with another author and discuss creating stories and all that writing means. Lynne, how are you this morning?
I'm very well, Jackie. Thanks for inviting me on.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your writing. And Heather, how goes it? Is all well with you?
Yes, it is. Thank you. I'm really excited to be on.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, we also have to say that Lynne and Heather are in possession of 2 furry friends who at some point may need a wee treat. So don't worry if the authors seem to be reaching for something. It's that they are keeping their pets exactly happy and rested. So this is what we need.
And hopefully quiet.
Be quiet, although I can't guarantee we might get excited about the stories. I'm sure we will, and it could generate a little bit of action there. So again, if you hear some barks or some meows, please don't worry, it's not the authors, it is their furry friends. But yeah, anyway, so I'd like to start, if we may. First of all, I wonder, could we have a waft of the books in question? Could you show us our books under discussion today? Look at that. We have The Girls in the Glen from Lynne and Unsolved by Heather. Wonderful. And they are out. The dates of these books coming out, can you remind me, Lynne, your book?
The book's out on Thursday the 18th.
Thursday, the 18th of May. Yeah, again, so if you're watching and really close to this date, watch for the 18th for that coming out. And Heather, your book?
It was out on Thursday, the 11th.
The 11th. So 2 books, close proximity to coming out. So the middle of May there, 2023. And if you're watching this after, well, great. Those books will be available. I'd like to start off by asking you both, though, becoming a crime writer, where in your history did that notion come into play? And do you see yourself as that, or are you still at the stage of, not sure, love writing these stories, but I'm not sure? Heather, do you want to set us off?
Yes, it's quite a long story, really. I mean, I've been writing since I was about 17, and I wrote a book by the time I was about 21, and I sort of naively thought if I sent it off to publishers and agents that I would get a publishing deal, and obviously I was quickly disabused of that. And then I spent some time in my 20s doing like writing courses and things, and I wasn't really writing crime at that time. I mean, it sort of had an edge of crime, but I wasn't even at the stage of kind of calling myself any particular kind of writer. And then I sort of had a bit of a break, really, because I had a bit of a nasty rejection from a course and things, and then job and kids kind of got in the way, and so really came back to it about 5 years ago. And I did a course where you had a full draft, if you'd written a full draft of a novel, because I'd sort of secretly been writing away in the meantime, and you could go on this course and sort of work through it. And I didn't really know what genre it was. And I remember sitting there on the course saying, oh, I don't know what genre this is. And everyone in the room said, crime. I said, well, are you sure? Because it's not a stereotypical, it's not this book, it was a previous book. it's not a stereotypical, and they were like, crime, and they were all sort of shouting crime at me. And I was really delighted, because by this stage I was aware of how nice the crime writing community is, how many events there are, how many people you can get to know. So I was kind of like, oh great, if I can fit into crime, then I'm delighted by that. So yeah, that's kind of, I suppose, when I started thinking that crime was the genre, and then it's taken a few books to get published after that.
I really like, though, that story of the support of other people enabling you to see what it is that you've got, you know, that because writing can be such a solitary profession or, you know, activity, but to be able to then come back and have that support and affirmation. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Heather, thank you for sharing that. Lynn, was your experience similar? How has it worked for you?
Yeah, it was similar in many ways. I was a photographer, and then I was a newspaper photographer for 25 years, and I covered a lot of murders, a lot of crime. And when kids came along and life got in the way as well, I'd always been like Heather, I'd always been really interested in writing. And the stories that I really liked to do when I was a photographer were feature type stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I should have been born in the time of picture post, when you had to these wonderful kind of behind the scenes stories. And I then decided that I was going to just have a little go with the Open University. I did an Open University degree, and they have some creative writing courses, which are so good. And again, so supportive. And I wasn't going to write crime. I was going to write something post-apocalyptic about the balkanization of Britain. It was going to be this and that. And then when I began to write it, very similar to Heather's experience, people were saying, oh, this feels a bit like crime. And then I realized that's what I read, that I was reading crime in all its various incarnations in different parts of the genre. And so I began to think of it more as a crime novel. And then I went on to do the MA at University of East Anglia, the crime fiction.
Wonderful.
MA.
Yeah, it's a great course. Yeah.
It's an amazing course, incredibly intense. But there, that kind of cemented my view that with crime fiction, you can go anywhere. And I have sometimes been asked, would you write other sorts of novels? And I thought, yeah, I wouldn't rule anything out. But would I need to go outside the crime genre? I'm not sure that I would. I haven't found anything that couldn't be explored within the idea of transgression and against and crime.
I totally agree with you. And I also think as well that what you can build around, you know, the crime, those social questions that can be asked, those observations about people, society, trends, it can all fit in quite nicely around this crazy thing called crime. So yeah, great. So thank you. So that's the coming into being writers. And I just wondered, let's talk about, if we can, the process of your latest books, from inception, as it were, of the idea. How do you play with the idea? How do you play with the creation? Which bit do you like? Which bit do you loathe? You know, are you the person who loves the edits, but you know, hates having to do like the synopsis thing? What is it for you? So Heather, tell us about your process, and in particular your process for Unsolved.
Yeah, so I had a couple of other books that went out in submission and didn't sell, but each time a book went out in submission, I would then sort of start the next one. And in the back of my mind for a while, because I love true crime podcasts, and I really wanted to write a book about a true crime podcast, and I wanted to look behind the making of the podcast and think, you know, why do allegiances change? People willing to tell the truth years on when they haven't at the time, and just how time shifts everything, and also what might motivate a podcaster to go and do that. And so, yeah, I started writing that. I tend to write about 1,000 words a day. I find the first draft process probably a bit of a slog, because you tend to try and stop and try and analyze how good it is, or if it's, and I think for me, really, I just need to get it down. And I find if I do 1,000 words a day, I can fit that around my day job and children and dog and everything, and I can sustain that over quite a long period of time. If I try and edge up to 1,500 or 2,000, I can do it for a while, but it doesn't sort of sustain as long. It's harder to fit in. And so, yeah, that's how I start. And then I'm trying to become a bit more of a plotter early on. Particularly, I think crime is just so kind of plot centric, really, and it's important that I've definitely wasted time in previous books having to go back and restructure everything because I haven't thought it through clearly. So I'm definitely trying to get better at that. But yeah, then I will, once I've got the full draft, I do enjoy the editing. I tend to overwrite. But I used to work as a journalist, as a sub-editor, and I'm quite used to cutting copies, so I quite enjoy that. Through and hacking bits out. And yeah, so that's sort of how I do it, really. But I like the Say If the Cat Writes a Novel book, and I tend to use that as a sort of reference, and I'll usually map my plot and structure against that structure, just to sort of as a sense check to think, where am I, is this going to work? Have I got the right scenes at the right times? But I'm not kind of religious about that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that. Again, I think, if anybody watching or listening who is considering setting off on the wonderful journey of being an author, I think it really helps to listen to so many different people. And what I've learned over my time talking to authors is you all have what works for you. The important thing is to find what works for you. And what struck me is the way you said, I try to push that word count, but it's not sustainable. Whereas I found the word count that is sustainable. And so,
like you, actually, I like learning from other people, and I do have some friends who are incredibly prolific and can write a lot of words a day. But what that did show me, actually, is that occasionally during a book I can do a blitz. So I might say, right, for the next week or 2 weeks I'm going to do more words a day. And I've realized that actually, if you are doing 2,000-3,000 a day, you don't have to sustain it that long, because you get to the end a lot quicker. So I have experimented a little bit with, like, okay, it's going to be a week where I go for it and try and get a 15,000 word bump on the word count or something.
Great, thank you. Lynne, are you similar or are you totally different in what you do?
Well, what I've found is The Girls in the Glen, I think, is the 6th novel I completed, because, like Heather, I had a couple that went out initially on submission and didn't get a bite. But what I've found is that every novel is different. And some of them, with The Girls in the Glen, I very carefully plotted it, because there are a number of threads. And I found that if I completed a chapter plan before I started writing, then that helped me sustain it on the way through. And hopefully I didn't really go too far off piste with the kind of general story arcs. But with other books that I've written, and that's Girls in the Glen is the 3rd book in the D.I. Shona Oliver series. But with others, I have done it slightly differently. And I think I've always been aware of the amount of time you spend planning is almost the same as the amount of time you're going to spend writing. And that kind of stress testing of the story is really important before you start. But you can do that in different ways. You can do it by writing it out, or you can do it by planning out. And I've just given it. I'm now just about to finish book 4 for Shona Oliver, and I've just realized that if every book's different, then that's okay. It's okay if to be a planner or a pantser or somewhere in between, because it's going to be on a sliding scale, whatever you do. And I think I remember Ian Rankin telling a story about going to his agent. I think it was Black and Blue, one of his books, early books, and he'd had some troubles with it, and going to his agent and saying, I've worked out how to write a crime novel now. And his editor saying, no, you've worked out how to write this crime novel now.
Yeah.
Because it's always different. But I think really with either process, it's really important to leave room for that improvisation, because something will occur to you at some point in the process. You're like, oh wait, what if we do this bit better? And sometimes I have started writing a chapter with no idea how the problem is going to be solved. And you go away and you have a cup of tea and you go off and you do the laundry and you walk the dog and you do those things. And I think once you are within that writing process, at the back of your conscious mind, there are little people typing away thinking, well, what if we do this? What if we do that? And that's actually a really enjoyable part of the process.
Yeah, I love that part of the process. I think as well, there's quite a lot of, in writing, sometimes it feels like there's quite a lot of shoulds, like I should do it this way, I should do that. And if you can kind of let go of that, and I definitely know what you mean about when you're in the flow and your subconscious is working things out for you. I find sometimes when I'm drying my hair, or it's when you're doing something quite mindless or driving or something like that, that your brain just sort of, just leave it for a while and your brain will work on it for you.
Yeah, I find I have a series of what I do now is I have a series of voice notes on my phone. I just record it all the time, and then maybe come back to it the next day. And by this point, you think, no, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Or you think, oh, wait a minute, yes, that would be great. And what if we do this as well? So that makes it fun. And I think it is important to be fun because, like you say, it's a long, isolating process, or it can be when you're actually getting those words down. And you know, you need that to be able to sustain yourself. In fact, you are doing this for some form of enjoyment, you know.
Yeah, I love what you say there, Lynn, about, you know, the enjoyment that there should be in this, the fun in creativity. There's the responsibility and the doing the work, but that to be able to tell those stories that obviously have resonated with you as authors before they take shape on a page. A quickie question that I like to ask, and it made me think as well in what you're saying about, you know, like each book is different. I always think it's a little bit like children. You know, it's wrong to have favorites, so I would never ask an author what's the favorite book that you've written. You know? But I just wonder, you know, Girls in the Glen and Unresolved, if they were one of your children, in the process of them coming into being, were they well behaved, or did you have to chastise and wrangle them into submission? Heather, how was it for you?
Oh, I mean, relatively well behaved.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. There was a little bit of restructuring that had to go on and moving things around. Actually, their sibling, the second book in the series I have now written, and I'm kind of near the end of the edits, their sibling was a dream. I mean, they slept through the night from 6 weeks. They were so easy. Yeah, that was a quick one. So maybe, slightly difficult older sibling there. I think the third child might be a nightmare as well when it comes to these two.
We wait to find out. Yeah, thank you. So, but book in the series, is this book 3?
This book 3, yeah.
Book 3.
Book 3.
So, so was it difficult, third child, or was it beautifully well behaved? These girls, were they good girls?
Well, this book was allowed to kind of run amok a little bit because it had 2 older siblings, you know, which in theory should keep it in line. But there was that already, that characterization to build on. So in some way it was easier because you already had the characters in place, and then you could take them a little bit further each time and learn a little bit more about the supporting characters as well as the main character. But it was I should say it was fairly well behaved.
Yeah, I love that.
A really good point, actually, because I'd never written a sequel until the second book in this series. And you're absolutely right, because you've kind of, the way I write them, I sort of have the victim in the cold case, and I have the podcaster in his story. And of course, all of those characters in his world, you've already established. And so you're just sort of moving them on, which is quite nice. But then I did also quite like having new characters sometimes I wanted something new and exciting. And other times it was quite nice to be able to fall back on, okay, well, we've set him up here. He has to go here now. Yeah,
because I find it's very interesting when you come to write sequels about the whole character development thing, and I always try to think even the main character, and as well as the supporting characters, what is it about this character that you're really not going to like, as well as what you're not, as well as what you do like, because you've established a character and then people see them in a certain way. But it's really interesting to explore maybe the darker side of their character as well, things that they might struggle with themselves. And I think you can go on and do that with the sequel, which is more difficult to do with a standalone. And that was one of the really appealing things for me when I thought about what did I want to write? Did I want to write standalones, or did I want to write a serial? And right from the beginning, I knew I wanted to write a serial, really, because I wanted to take these characters in as many different ways as I could, while still keeping them within that kind of believability for their character, and really make their lives miserable at times.
Which you have.
But also make their lives maybe, happy at times too, because that was the appeal for a series for me. The idea that you can spend several 100,000 words with a particular character and learn all their nuances as well.
And Lynne, it's wonderful. You bring us to the next point that I wanted to look at. Thank you for that beautiful segue without even so that thing of the main protagonist, really, and D.I. Shona Oliver, and quite right, I love that mix that is there of, somebody who we know their good points, but we've also been made aware over the course of these books that, her life hasn't been perfect, and she's not perfect. So again, for maybe people who aren't familiar with your books, do you want to give us a little bit of insight into her?
Well, D.I. Shona Oliver is based in Dumfries and Galloway. She's and she's also a lifeboat volunteer, because that's on the Solway Firth, which forms the border between Scotland and England. And as an individual, she's come from quite a difficult background. She grew up without her parents. She came from a very kind of deprived area of a scheme in the east of Glasgow, but moved almost as soon as she could, and then went to London and was a detective with the City of London Police rather than the Met. She's constantly telling people it's not the Met.
Not the Met.
City of London is different. Almost telling that. And then having had both her husband and her daughter were finding life a little bit difficult. Her daughter is 14, 15 when the books begin. They decided to make the move back to Scotland and to have a kind of life change. And so she left the city police and became the detective inspector in charge of a rural area. And the difference, it's interesting because the City of London has 8,000 regular inhabitants, and then 500,000 people come in during each day as commuters and workers. And in some ways, why I chose Dumfries and Galloway, it was a bit like that too. So you've got a small resident population, but you've got lots of people traveling through, which is great for the opportunities for crime fiction, because if you run out of homegrown crimes, you can import a few with the people that are coming through. And so as a rural area, it's very much something that interacts with the world, and that's really the way Shona is. She comes from a background that in some ways would have constrained her life opportunities, but she's very much outward looking and wants to engage, but she still has that idea of this is what happens to you if you make the wrong choices, because she's seen that as she's been growing up. So hopefully it makes her quite nuanced in the way she applies the law, because she has sympathy for the people that have got on the wrong side of it for whatever reasons, because she knows how easy it is to get there.
To be on that, Thank you, Lynne. Thank you, Heather. Your main protagonist. Tell us about them.
So Cal Lovett is the true crime podcaster in the series, and it was interesting actually picking a sort of male protagonist. He is very much surrounded by strong women, and that's sort of fundamental to who he is. When he was a child, his older sister Margot, who is 10 years older than him, when he was 9, she vanished and she's never been found. And that's very much what sort of drives him. His sister was a sort of woman ahead of her time, really. She was quite feisty and independent in a time when it wasn't necessarily the way women were supposed to be. And so he's very governed by that. He has a wife and a teenage daughter, and he has a very strong relationship with his daughter that's really important to me. And he travels to Aberdeenshire to investigate a cold case of a missing woman who rode her horse into the woods 35 years ago and didn't come out. And there's obviously parallels with his own sister, and the reason that he does these podcasts is all to do with his family background. He doesn't get on well with his mother. It's a really complicated situation for him. But yeah, it was really interesting to move him to Aberdeenshire. I mean, I grew up partly in Aberdeenshire. We moved there when I was 10, and the novel is set in the foothills of Benahee, where I grew up. And I guess, but he's kind of like an outsider coming in, and in a way I sort of felt like that because I've been born in England and I moved up when I was 10, and my mum's family are all from there, some of my dad's family too, so it's very much a kind of family part of the woods. But I did feel like, you know, an outsider coming to particularly rural Aberdeenshire, and the landscape is just so important to me as well. I mean, we partly for the first year we lived in a caravan while we built like a barn into a house, and it was something like the worst winter to hit Aberdeen in 7 years, and so we were really close to the landscape. It was right there kind of like bashing at us, and I just spent my teenage years kind of roaming, and I love that about Scotland, that you have this sort of freedom to roam around the place. And I used to explore the foothills of Benahee, and when I came up with the idea of the podcast, a lot of the podcasts I was listening to are American podcasts or Canadian, and I particularly like the ones that have very isolated locations and are very rural and very kind of, I think they just appeal to me, but I didn't feel like I knew those places well enough to write about them. And so I kind of, my mind went obviously to where I grew up, and I do just, there's little parts of woodland and places I just remember like exploring these little clusters of trees that might be in the middle of the heather on a hill, and you just think, does anyone ever go there except the deer or except and I do think the potential for the sort of isolation. And I suppose like a lot of places, you know, if you think about Aberdeenshire and the Highlands, they're very idyllic, kind of beautiful places, but to live in, you know, all year round, it's completely different, and it can be very challenging, and you reliant on the community around you. So I really wanted to explore that. And the victim part of the novel is told from the perspective of the victim as well. And she, again, as a woman ahead of her time, she's not always that likable. She is very feisty and can be very unpleasant. And it was important that I didn't have, you know, a victim who is purely one thing. And she works as a waitress in a country house hotel. And I did, as a teenager, work as a waitress in a country house hotel there. So I absolutely loved going back. I mean, I worked with much nicer people, and you know, I didn't have the things happen that she does, but I loved kind of going back to that kitchen environment and the camaraderie you have when you're in a team and things. So yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Writing from experience, and writing from things that interest you, that you're passionate about. You mentioned, Lynn, Shona Oliver's being the lifeboat volunteer, and I can see on your table at the back the RNLI boots. Yeah. So are you a lifeboat volunteer?
No, I live well inland, I have to tell you. I'm in the middle of Lincolnshire. I live well inland. But I did used to sail, and I did used to be part of a racing crew on the Bristol Channel when I was based in Cardiff. And actually, Shona Oliver came about because Penarth Lifeboat at that point, a long time ago, like back in the late 80s, early 90s, had a female lifeboat volunteer, and they were very unusual at that point. Not so unusual now. I think about 20% of our NLI volunteers are women now. But I saw her, and I was working for a Welsh newspaper at that point. I was working for the Western Mail at that point, and I just thought, oh, I have to do a story. I have to, you know, to talk to this person, and really find out why she does this, because, you know, you're not even getting paid. You're a volunteer. You're putting your life in danger for others, and she's stuck in my mind as a character. And for one reason or another, we never managed to do this story, but she stayed with me. And that's what the books explore, why you will put yourself on the line for others, because it's not just about getting paid for it. And, you know, and I did find when I went out to do research with the RNLI, they've been so great. The local lifeboat up on the Solway Firth, they've been, you know, they've been great. And I'm quite close to Cleethorpes here. They have a similar kind of profile in terms of lots of mud, lots of commercial traffic, lots of holiday makers as well. So they've been great at talking me through various scenarios, how you would do these various things.
Brilliant.
So I brought a little bit of my background to
into
it,
that
as a sailor, but yeah, she's much braver than I am, much braver than I would be.
Yeah.
Really.
I love it. She is fearless in the places that she puts herself. But tell us about the girls in the Glen, that location. Why choose that, and is it a location that you were familiar with, or did you have to explore that to find that place for the setting of the plot there?
So when I first started thinking about series and setting it on the Scottish English board, I happened to look at what sort of stories I might explore, and one of the stories I wanted to explore was the Border Reivers.
Yeah.
These were notorious, you will know about these, Jackie, notorious mafia-like families that both in Scotland and England that held the Scottish and English parliaments at bay for hundreds of years. Border law was the law. Didn't matter what anybody else thought. And I thought this is a really interesting area to take a law enforcement professional and put her into this location as it is now. And are the Reivers still there? Does it still operate in that way? And so I went to research. I knew the area a little bit, and there I wanted to look at habitat restoration as well, which is a big issue at the minute, particularly in Scotland. How we do this kind of rewilding, how we make it work for local people. And so I went up and spent some time up there and researched. And the Terrace Moss project is a 10-year project to rewild a grouse moor. And it was lovely, because the great thing about research, I love to research. I could just research all the time, really. Writing the book is when you have to end it a little bit. But getting out and just going out and chatting to people and talking to gamekeepers and talking to local people and talking to people who are involved more generally in rewilding in Scotland about what the issues are. Because this is about landscape. This is about how people relate to the landscape. And one of the reasons I set it on the Scotland and England border was, I think I was influenced a little bit by The Bridge.
Yes.
The Bridge TV series.
Yeah.
I love that idea about putting two systems up against each other. And I've lived all around the UK. I've lived in Wales, I've lived in London. And so I had that experience of the people are the same, but people are also different.
Yes.
And they're very much influenced by the landscape that they live in and the choices they make about just how they make a living. So it's set on the fictional Beal Moss, and I also wanted to bring in the idea of an archaeological dig, because one of the other areas I worked in was archaeology folks, and I sit on the committee of Lincoln Archaeology Group now as well, and we run large-scale community projects. But I wanted to bring this idea right from the beginning, but I had to wait till the third book till I found a narrative that I wanted to use, and partly it's about an archaeological dig that uncovers a body which turned out to be from the 1980s, and Shona then thinks, could this be one of the missing victims of the Girls in the Glen serial killer? Her bosses want her to focus on the attempted assassination of a politician, but she's really pulled between cases past and present, to solve both of them, really, to understand both of them. And really, when I was talking to my archaeological friends, they were like, what took you so long to write an archaeological thread in crime fiction? Because the two things, they go together so well, that kind of investigation of things in the past.
Yeah, Lynn, it's totally, and then that link, Heather, with your book, the idea of past crimes. Did you take pleasure in being able to sort of like past and present, weaving that together?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that because I think I wanted to show. When I set out, I wasn't quite sure how the resolution of the podcast was going to go, because in real life, podcasts don't always get the answers, and they don't always, and I think obviously for a crime fiction novel you have to have a certain amount of satisfaction at the end, but so I did want to show her perspective and what was happening at the time, and I wanted the reader to have that insight as well, and then to watch Cal try and figure things out in the present day, and also to have these characters who had been uncomfortable about things in the past and they hadn't said. And there's a couple of particularly female characters, actually, one of whom was very young at the time and wasn't listened to. And I think that's quite interesting as well, to explore those sorts of reasons as to why things might not have progressed in the way they did at the time. But yeah.
Lovely. I love that link. I mean, I think we did, well, not we, but you, or that link that there is between both of your writing, of the past still speaking to us, the past still bringing ideas. Now, I am aware of time, and so don't want to prevent you from the rest of your day. So if you wouldn't mind, I am going to bring our session to a close, probably with a couple of questions. And the first is to ask you, and of course not the ending and not the tying things together nicely, but the plot that you've developed through these novels. What is the aspect that thrills you the most when you look back at what you've created? What gives you a special tingle?
Well, for me, for this particular book, being the third one in the series, it's how we know not only Shona, but the guys that are around her, the guys and girls that are around her team, because we get to explore much more about what drives them as well. Okay, so revealing more about the team, who they are, how they function. Okay, so that's for the girls in the Glen. Okay, and for Unsolved.
Yeah, so I think it's probably him digging back into his sister's past. So the book kind of opens, he secures an interview with a serial killer who has never before granted an interview. He's in Broadmoor, and he ends up knowing a little bit more about Cal than Cal had bargained for. And I think that is the sort of catalyst for breaking open some of the things that he's been burying for a really long time. And so I think I really, looking back at how he then starts to analyze his relationships, and it affects his relationships all around, his wife, his daughter, his mother, and then to find, because he understands what it's like to lose a loved one and not to have that resolution. I think the relationship that he then has with the missing girl who he's investigating, Layla, her parents, I think that's quite special, because they are completely different. They come from completely different worlds. They're basically crofters, eking out a quite sort of tricky existence on the side of a hill with this grief unresolved from 35 years. They think they know what happened to their daughter, but it's never been proved. And then you have this guy who's from the Midlands coming in, seemingly very different on the outside, but actually they have the same pain inside. And he really does understand. And later they understand him too, when he has similar experiences.
Yeah. Oh, Lynne, Heather, it has been an absolute delight to be able to be in conversation, to learn more about yourselves, to be able to talk about crime fiction, to be able to see how authors like yourselves, with different process, different ways of approaching things, different protagonists, and yet you both have created, in the novels we've been talking about, just an exciting and a satisfying read. And as I mentioned, viewers, listeners, you see, not one, but two books that I think will keep you deep in the darkness and then bring you beautifully back to the light. Highly recommend them, please. And Lynne and Heather, I mean, it's great in the conversation to hear that the books that we're talking about, of course, there's more siblings on the way, as you said, Heather. So this is great as well, that you draw us in. And I think especially with series, you see, we start to invest our time and our emotions in the protagonists you create. And as readers, I'm really sorry, we say, you know, come have some more, please. Want to know what they're up to. So that is great. But for now, we'll draw our consultation to a close. Thank you for your time and your conversation together. And I hope we get a chance to meet face to face in real life, not just via the screen, and chat more. Thank you so much, both of you, and all the very best.
Thank you, Jackie.
So much.
Lovely
Thank
to be
you.
here. Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye for now.